right, well, welcome today, this morning. My name is Sam. I'm the Horticulture Extension Agent for Davidson County. That means that I work for the County of Davidson County as well as NC State University. And we work with agriculture and agricultural producers as well as home gardeners. So I give assistance and consult with people that grow plants, and this includes homeowners and gardeners, but also farmers who grow fruits and vegetables, and plant nurseries, and landscapers. Provide assistance and training and education and consulting for all of those people who grow plants in Davidson County. It was a fun job, and today here Ann has asked me to come talk to you guys about composting, and so I'm going to talk about composting today for you guys, and just give you some background and give you all the information you need if you do compost. If you want to compost, if you have no idea what compost is, you're just here to get some coffee, that's fine too. We'll be talking about composting. What is composting? And the idea is that everything that's organic, that's living, at some point it dies and then it gets decomposes and it breaks down. And what we want to do is we want to take stuff that was living and we want to control how it breaks down, and we want it to break down and decompose in a good way that then we can use that product back in our gardens or in our potted plants. And we want to make sure that we take all the stuff that we have and recycle it and reuse it, and put it back into our gardens, and it becomes a very useful type of amendment that we can use in our gardens if we can make it so that it decomposes and control that process, then we can use it in our gardens. So that's the whole idea of composting, is recycling the things that you normally might throw away and making a useful product that's going to help our gardens, it's going to improve our soil. So that's the whole idea of this today. So we're using this natural process of decay that all organic organisms go through, this process where they decay, where it gets pulled apart at the end of its life cycle and reused and recycled back into the system. So we're going to change organic wastes into a valuable humus-like material called compost, that some people and a lot of gardeners might call black gold, because it is very good for your soil, it's very good for your garden. That's what we're doing. It disposes of food and yard waste through a natural process. It enhances soil, and it does also release some essential nutrients back into your plants. And I always say this, compost will feed your plants, but that's not accurate, because plants are good at feeding themselves. That's what photosynthesis is they take sunlight and they take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they use those two pieces and they make sugars from sunlight and carbon dioxide and water, so they feed themselves. So what we're doing when we put compost out or fertilizer is we're just enabling them to do the photosynthesis. So that's what we're doing with compost. It makes a great soil amendment. It does all kinds of great things to our soils. It really improves them. Where we live here in the Piedmont, North Carolina, our soils are really red clay, a lot of red clay. If you dig down outside, it's going to be thick. It's going to be, if it's dry, it's going to turn into a brick. If it's wet, it's going to be a big red muddy patch. And that's what our red clay is. But if we want to improve that soil and make it better so it grows plants better, we can do things like adding organic matter. It's going to be great. Come on in, learn about composting. So it supplies organic matter to the soil. It's going to attract beneficial organisms like earthworms that are our friends in the garden. It's going to stimulate beneficial soil microorganisms that help our plants grow. It's going to increase the water holding capacity so we don't have plants drying out as much. And it also increases the ability of the soil to hold on to good nutrients that will support plant growth. So organic matter is a great addition to any soil, and compost or manure or any type of mulch, all of that's very good for our soil. So that's what why we add compost. It promotes soil health, it improves the soil tilth and friability, improves the drainage, loosens heavy clay soils, which is what we got. we got those big heavy clay soils, and if we want to improve them so that they drain better, so that they support soil or plant life better, and so that they're not as compacted, which we have a big problem here with compacted soils. So we can do all that with compost and organic matter. So that's why gardeners call it black gold, because it does all these great things for our soil. So that's why we want to be able to make it, and you can make it with stuff that normally you might throw away. So turning one man's trash is another man's treasure. That's the key behind making your own compost and using compost, is turning trash into treasure. It is, it's not directly a fertilizer. It does contain some plant nutrients. It slowly releases those nutrients, but it's not like a fertilizer. It's not like if you use Miracle-Gro and make the blue water, that's going to give a boost immediately to your plants. Compost is going to slowly add nutrients that those plants need to do photosynthesis. So it's not directly a fertilizer, but it is similar to that, and it does all these other things that fertilizers don't do, like improve the soil shape and its ability to hold water, its structure, and its capacity to recycle nutrients in the system. So it's not a fertilizer. I think it's, in many ways, it's better than a fertilizer, because fertilizers come and get used and then they're gone, whereas compost sticks around and improves the whole environment in the soil. So I think compost is better than fertilizer. The other benefits is it reduces our waste stream in terms of the waste that we create. It reduces the off-gassing of methane that happens in landfills. It reduces some nutrient runoff, and it can save transport costs and impacts. Basically, saving our landfills. If we think about the total municipal solid waste generated by material, a lot of stuff that ends up in our landfills is stuff that could be composted. Things like food scraps, wood, paper and paperboard. These are organic materials, yard trimmings. These are stuff that could be composted. That it doesn't need to get wasted and end up in a landfill and end up just sitting there and slowly decomposing in a landfill where it doesn't do anybody any good. It just makes a big smelly mess. Instead, we can take that stuff and reuse it and create this black gold for our landscapes. That's the whole point of composting, trash into treasure. So it doesn't end up in our landfills. Instead, it'll end up back in our gardens, supporting plant health. So if you do want to make a compost pile at home, it's not too complicated. And I'll talk about how you might do it by selecting a location, if you want to put it in a certain type of container, how you might make a pile and maintain a compost pile, and then how you might know when it's done and then be able to use it in your garden. So if you do want to compost at home, you do want to be careful and select a good location. You want to put it in a good spot where it's on level ground. It's going to have to be near a source of water, because you will have to add some water to it. At least 2 feet away from any structure, especially a house. Because it is decomposition, it is a form of controlled decomposition, controlled rotting, is you don't want to get that stuff near your house, where you don't want your house to rot or to decompose. So we do want to keep it away from a structure, and then close to the source of materials that we're going to use when we make compost, so we don't have to be dragging stuff and carrying it all over the place. So we can just plop it right into that pile. A good work area, and ideally good drainage underneath it, so you don't want to put it on top of a cement pad on top of your driveway or anything like that. You want it on top of soil that will drain some water, because if it sits in water, it's going to get gross and it's not going to be good. There's all types of containers that you could use. People make all these things out of old pallets. I see that a lot. They'll make these bins. You can use just chicken wire and make a big circle. That's a great way to make compost. Then you can, if you want to do bigger, you can use cinder blocks and make these big bins with cinder blocks. There's bigger and smaller ways to do it. The easiest way is to just make a pile. You don't need to buy fancy equipment, because decomposition happens, compost happens. So if you do make a pile, you just simply mound up organic materials, and then when you add stuff, you add it to the middle and you shovel stuff on top of it. So if you do just make a pile of organic matter and leave it in your yard, it will eventually break down and it'll decompose and it'll make compost eventually. Our idea though behind managing the system is that if we manage the compost pile, it's ready a lot quicker, it's a lot less mess, maybe it doesn't smell as bad, maybe it heats up more. So that's why we want to, you could just make a pile, but I recommend you manage it a little bit more so it's not as messy. But compost does just happen. But you don't need to buy one of these fancy things that they sell. You don't need to buy a fancy compost system if you don't want to. Ideally, you'd like to, keep it contained. That's why people have these little bins, or they use the pallets to make them. You need a fair amount of space, about 3 feet by 3 feet, to really get enough material in there where you're going to get a lot of bacterial action and decomposition in there. So it has to be about 3 feet by 3 feet, and you do want it to be accessible and easy to reach, somewhere where maybe you can get your wheelbarrow in if you use a wheelbarrow, or you can go pull a bucket in and drop it in there. And then ability to mix materials, and the big challenge with compost is creature access, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but if we can ideally keep some of our pest animals away, that'd be best. You can get one of these fancy bins that they make. They make all kinds of these fancy black plastic bins to make compost in, and it'll help. It'll make it go quicker generally, and you can do it in a smaller area and keep it contained. You can buy any of these things and they'll work, but you don't have to. You can just make a pile if you want. But things like the tumbler here work well. It just allows you to mix up those materials quicker. So these will work. They're great. It's small, it's neat, it's tidy, but it's certainly not necessary to make compost. And so compost happens. Decomposition is a natural part of life. It happens all the time. Everything will decompose. Generally, it'll get all organic materials will get taken apart by bacteria, by fungi in our environment. So microorganisms will initiate decomposition under favorable environmental conditions, and we want to encourage them because we want to encourage them to break down pieces of waste. And we encourage them by giving them food, by giving them oxygen, by giving them moisture and water, and by monitoring the temperature at which they break things down. But like I said, it will just happen. Organic things, it's in their nature to break down and decompose. I've known people who have composted a lot of strange things. I had a friend who put a dead raccoon at the bottom of his compost pile, and he went back 2 years later and it was completely decomposed, and he used it as compost. So organic material will break down and it will create compost eventually. I've even heard of people wanting to do, when they die, want to do human composting, because we'll break down eventually as well. So organic material will happen, compost happens. Where do these decomposers, this bacteria, these fungi, where do they come from, these soil microorganisms? Well, they're kind of all over the place already. These decomposers are in the soil, they're on leaves, they're in food scraps. If you use any type of manure, it's in that manure, as well as if you have any finished compost, it's going to be in that finished compost and it's going to move into the new materials. So these microorganisms are all over the place. Sorry for any germaphobes out there. But we do live in a world teeming with microbes that are everywhere, and in this case they're doing us a great benefit because they're creating this black gold for lots of gardens. Each of these microorganisms will add to the compost pile, and they will be there. They do make these things called compost starters that I see people selling at garden centers. It's a bag. I don't know what's in there. You don't need it. If you want a compost starter, boy, I could sell you a boat or something. You don't need that. these microorganisms will be there, they'll be in your compost pile, especially where we are. It's hot, it's humid, where there's lots of stuff out there that wants to decompose things. What is the best food for our decomposers? How do we make compost? What do we feed them? You know, all organic materials will compost, but not all should be added to a pile in our backyard. Things that do well are things like garden trimmings, or kitchen scraps, or grass clippings, or hardwood leaves. All that's great stuff. It's organic, it'll break down, it'll make compost. Also things like used potted soil. If we have a type of animal, we could use their manure, sawdust, or animal hair. We do want to avoid certain materials, even though it's organic in nature. We just don't want to attract those pests. So things like oils and fats and grease and meat, fish, or dairy products, or unwashed eggshells, all of these things tend to attract animals. Raccoons, possums, skunks, rats, we don't want those in our compost pile. Snakes, we don't want that. So let's not add the things that they like. We also don't want to add in hard to kill weeds, especially weeds from our garden that may have gone to seed. We don't want those weed seeds in there, it's just going to propagate them. So if you have a bad weed, a bindweed, quackgrass, the one that I really battle a lot, spiny amaranth, really hate that one. But lots of weeds, if it's gone to seed, we shouldn't put it in our compost pile, just because we don't want to, you know, later on, if we got great compost and it looks good, but those weed seeds are in there and we put it out and then, wait, we got more weeds coming up. Yeah, so we want to be careful with that. We want to avoid that. We don't want to put any cat or dog waste, just because it will break down, but it might have some pathogens in there, so we don't want to add that waste. And then plants, any type of plants or plant material that's got a bunch of insects on it, or that's got a bad disease on it. You know, some of our annual vegetables at the end of their lifespan will get a lot of bad diseases, and we want to be careful not to compost those, just because we don't want to keep spreading that disease, whatever it is, through the compost. So we want to avoid those materials. We don't want to add any lime. It's okay to add some wood ashes, but not too much. A little bit of wood ashes in a compost pile is fine. It's going to add some plant nutrients, some potash, but if you change the pH too much, it's going to get sour and it's going to start to smell, and it's not going to be pleasant for you as a person with a compost pile to have a smelly pile. But a little bit of wood ashes is fine. Your compost workers will thrive if you give them a balanced diet. And so a little bit of chemistry, but I'm not going to get too into chemistry. These decomposers, these bacteria, when they do this process of breaking things down, they need two pieces of their diet. They need carbon and they need nitrogen. And they need a combination of these two things of carbon and nitrogen to do this decomposition process. So we want to make sure that we give them stuff that has a lot of carbon and stuff that has a lot of nitrogen, and ideally keep this in a balanced ratio. Carbon to nitrogen, we generally call it greens and browns. Browns is carbon-rich material, and greens is nitrogen-rich material. And we want to keep this balanced, the greens and the browns. Our browns are things that are heavy in carbon, and it's going to be things like hardwood leaves, oak leaves, maple leaves, sweet gum leaves. All of these hardwood leaves on deciduous trees that fall in the fall time, these are great for making compost. They're full of carbon, they break down rapidly, so that's a great source. For people who bag them up and put them on the street, I think they're wasting a great resource for the garden because they do a great job of breaking down and feeding plants. But also things like straw or paper, office paper, not that shiny glossy stuff that you get junk mail in the mail, but instead things like office paper that's white paper, or sawdust, or any type of animal bedding or hay straw or pine straw. Any of that is going to be a good brown material with lots of carbon. We want to balance that with the green material, which is very nitrogen rich. Things such as vegetable scraps or coffee grounds, grass clippings, or any type of manure if you have an animal. These are the greens, heavy in nitrogen. And we want to balance these two things. I've known a number of people who tell me I'm going to do great for my garden, I'm going to start a compost pile. I've made a pile of my kitchen scraps in the backyard, and it's only kitchen scraps, and if you do that and put only kitchen scraps in a pile, it's just going to be greens, and it's going to be smelly and wet and disgusting. So you have to balance. You can't just use kitchen scraps. You have to put brown stuff in there as well. If you do just brown stuff, it'll break down, but slowly, really slowly. So that's why you want to get that balance between the greens and the browns. The trouble can often be as browns accumulate in the fall time. You get a lot of these browns, this carbon-rich material in the fall time. So lots of hardwood leaves, lots of plant debris when you're doing things in your garden, you're deadheading your plants, you're pulling up your vegetables. You get a lot of this brown material in the fall, and they decay very slowly. If there's too much, if they're not balanced with greens, then they can tie up nitrogen in your soil. That's why when people tell me about they get wood chips, they're like, "Sam, I got wood chips. That's great. It's organic matter from my yard. How do I use them?" I tell them, don't till them into the soil, because wood chips aren't going to help you that way. Because what happens is, like I was talking about, those microorganisms, that is bacteria, is they need some carbon and some nitrogen. If you put wood chips, it's really heavy in carbon, and they're going to grab nitrogen from your soil. And then those plants can't use that nitrogen. So wood chips are great if you leave them on top of your soil, just don't mix them into your soil. And that's true with these brown stuff. It's great as a mulch on top, but if you just go out and get big buckets full of sawdust and mix it into your soil, it's going to tie up all that nitrogen. You're never going to get any nitrogen in your soil. And then the greens, they generally decay rapidly. They tend to be wetter, have a lot more moisture, so they have poor aeration. They may have foul odors if composted alone. That's very true. If you just make a pile of banana peels, it'll get gross. They tend to accumulate in spring and summer, and they'll supply that nitrogen, and you want to mix those with the brown. So ideally, we don't have to measure stuff and do math and all those things, but ideally is you want a mixture of browns and greens to create a good carbon to nitrogen ratio so that those decomposers can do their work. They have lots of both kinds of food. They can be really active. They can make lots of babies. They can eat lots of organic material. So ideally, we want to mix things like grass clippings with hardwood leaves. This is a great mixture. Ideally, we want a 30-to-1 ratio. We don't have to be precise about this, but we do need both browns and greens to go together to break down and make compost. In terms of the particle size, the smaller the piece, the faster it's going to break down. So hardwood leaves are great. You heard me talk about that. If we can somehow chop up those hardwood leaves, it's even better. They're going to break down even quicker. So if you've got a big pile of oak leaves from your oak tree, if you can run your lawnmower over it, that'll be great. It'll help chop them up. They've got these leaf blowers now where they've got a reverse setting where it'll suck it up and chop it up and put it in a bag for you. That'll work well. Any way that you can break up that particle size is going to help with that decomposition. So shred hardwood leaves and break twigs and small branches, and shred newspaper and cardboard and palm fronds. Grind up stumps if you have it, and coarsely chop large pieces of vegetable matter. So we don't want to put a whole big log in there. You say, hey, I got browns, it's a log. It's not going to break down very quickly. You want to chop it up, get pieces in small pieces. There's a lot more surface area then, a lot more area for these decomposers to get on that material and start picking it apart and breaking it apart. So the smaller the particle size, the better. When we make our compost pile, for faster decompositions, what we want to do is make sure it gets a fair amount of airflow. We add some of this brown material that'll keep it aerated, and then layer those greens and browns, greens and browns, greens and browns when we make the pile. So it might look something like this. We put some twigs on the bottom, then we put some grass clippings, and then we put some hardwood leaves, and then we put a bunch of vegetable scraps, And then on the top, we've covered it with a layer of hay straw. We've alternated, we've made a little lasagna here, and then we've kept it wet with water. So there you go, you get lots of contact between those greens and the browns. It looks good, it's an alternating pile of greens and browns. And we are gonna have to provide oxygen. It's gonna be a key component of those microorganisms and decomposers. They're gonna need oxygen, they're gonna need water to do their jobs and break things down. Without oxygen, it gets disgusting, it gets anaerobic. Anaerobic means without oxygen, and anaerobic decomposition. If you think about, if you've ever had a bunch of leaves get in a pot with standing water, and it just starts to smell really foul. What happens is decomposition happens without oxygen, but they're different type of microorganisms that produce all these weird chemicals like these alcohols and these organic acids that smell bad. So we don't want that in our pile, in our compost. We want there to be oxygen available for those microorganisms to work. So incorporate some bulky materials like twigs or pine needles or wood chips or straw. It's going to provide some airspace. We're also going to be turning the pile. Especially if you start smelling an odor, you're going to need to turn it. So talking about turning the pile is you're getting air in there. You're going to mix fresh air in there. You can buy tools to turn your pile, or you could use a shovel, or you could use a pitchfork. Whatever works for you. Again, you don't need to buy fancy things to make compost. And you don't even really need to turn a pile to make compost. You can make a nice pile and then leave it, and then a year or two later, it'll be great compost. What we're doing by turning the pile is making it go faster. It's encouraging that decomposition to be more rapid. So then we can get nice compost just a couple months later, just 3 months later versus 2 years later. That's why we're turning the pile, just to encourage more rapid decomposition. We also will need to provide some moisture, to provide some water, because those microorganisms will need oxygen, they also need water to do their job. So rapid decomposition requires optimum water content. If it's too dry, everything slows down, those microorganisms stop working as hard, they sit around, they say, hey, man, it's too hot and dry, I can't work. That's why you gotta give them enough water. If it's too wet, then you don't have any oxygen and it becomes that gross, stinky, smelly, slimy anaerobic pile. So it should be, a fair amount of water in it. It shouldn't be too dry. If it is too dry, we're gonna add some water. If it's too wet, we can add some type of that brown material back in there, and boom, it'll be a good mixture at that point. That's why it helps to have, be somewhat near a hose where you can just spray some water on it. We generally, where we're at, we get a fair amount of irrigation or rainwater precipitation throughout the year. We get about 50 inches of rain a year. The problem becomes is sometimes in the year we'll get a week or two without rain, especially in the summertime. We got about 10 days in July this year where it didn't rain, and that's when everything dries out. That's when our plants dry out, and that's when the pile like this might dry out as well. And we want to encourage it, give it some extra water. It might seem silly, I'm watering my pile of garbage in my backyard, but it will encourage that decomposition. And if you take your compost seriously, you're going to end up with great compost. And our temperature is, as these microbes do their job and be really active, they're going to have a high metabolic rate, and the temperature of the pile is going to go up. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a big pile of fresh wood chips. Oftentimes it'll be smoking, it'll be steaming. That's because there's all these organisms in there rapidly chewing through this material, and they've got a high metabolic rate, and so they're increasing the temperature there. And ideally in a good compost pile, it's going to get hot. It's going to get hotter than the air temperature. It's going to get up to 120, 130, 140 degrees. Ideally, and that's a good sign, if your pile gets really hot and steamy, it means that those microorganisms are rapidly working. And if you ever go buy compost, mostly they have to prove that their pile got hot. they have to take the temperature every day, and it has to be above 140 degrees for 3 days in a row, because that's the temperature that will kill a lot of pathogens, weed seeds, plant diseases. So ideally we want our compost pile to get hot, because it'll kill things. Critical mass is needed. That's the ideal pile of 3 by 3 by 3. The size of your compost pile. Optimal temperature for decomposition is about 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Microbial activity will start to decline if it gets a little bit hotter, but we do want to get that pile nice and really hot. If you have that mixture of browns and greens, and you get it started, it stays nice and wet, that pile is going to warm up. And that's exactly what we want. It's a nice warm pile of compost. And then maintaining a pile of compost, we want to turn it occasionally. It really depends on how much work you want to do. Turning a compost pile can be work. So if we do more work, it'll be ready quicker. If we do less work, it'll take longer to get ready. But it will break down eventually if we put the right materials in there. But when we turn it, it'll increase rate of decomposition. It'll expose weed seeds, insect larvae, and pathogens to lethal temperatures at the middle of the pile, where it's going to get the hottest in that core of the pile. We can continue to add more organic matter. If we have more greens, we've got a nice pail full of kitchen scraps from our peppers and cucumbers and all of those things. We can go add it to the middle of the pile and put more browns on top of it, and it'll just continue to break down that material. And then we control the water content. Basically, it just means keep it wet when we get dry weather and when the pile dries out. Slow or cold composting is decomposition will happen, like I say. If you start with a 3 to 5 foot pile of leaves, it'll break down eventually. You can add some food waste, and then it'll be slow. It'll take a year or two to break down. Food waste may attract some critters, and you may not get it hot enough to kill everything in the middle of that pile. But it's a perfectly valid way of composting to just make a pile and leave it, and then 2 or 3 years later, go dig at the bottom and find some great black gold down there. If you want it to get hot and do fast, you're going to have to be more precise in the greens and browns. Make sure you have to keep it wet, and you're going to have to turn it to add some aeration there. And then after about 3 to 4 months, you can have a nice big pile of compost, and you don't have to go to Lowe's and buy it for $5 a bag. Instead, you can just have it that you made yourself just from garbage. So there you go. So how long does it take? A year if you don't turn it, several months if you aerate, keep it watered, and construct it of both greens and browns. And then 3 to 4 months if you were diligent. If you keep turning it pretty regularly, you'll have compost pretty quickly. When is it done? That's the next question. It's done when the color is dark brown to black. It's crumbly, it's loose, it looks like nice soil. It has a nice earthy smell. It's not going to smell bad. It's not going to smell like garbage. It's not going to smell rotten. It's going to smell like soil, like organic soil. It's going to smell like if you went out into the woods, grabbed a pile of leaves in the woods that's been breaking down. It's going to smell nice and earthy like that. You're not going to be able to tell what the feedstock is. You're not going to be able to pick stuff out and be like, hey, that was a banana. It's going to all look decomposed and black. And it's going to also shrink to about 1/3 of its original size as it breaks down and decomposes. So that's when you'll know that it's finished. And you can use finished compost in many, many ways in the landscape. You can use it if you make it. You can use finished compost if you buy it by the bag. You can use finished compost if you go to a landscape supply and say, hey, can you guys drive over a dump truck to compost to my house? They'll do that if you pay the money. So there's lots of ways to use compost. You can use it as a soil amendment, which is something you mix into your soil. So you can mix it in when you're planting a vegetable garden. You can mix it in when you're planting any type of woody ornamental. If you're planting new bushes, new shrubs in your landscape, it's great to mix in compost. mix that stuff into the soil. If you grow stuff in pots and you've got potting soil that's kind of old and you want to refresh it a little bit, you can mix in some compost into that stuff. You can really mix it in anywhere and it's going to do great. It'll improve the water and nutrient retention. It'll loosen our compacted clay soils that we have everywhere. A lot of people care a lot about their turf grass and their lawns. You can add compost to that as a top dressing, add about 1/2 inch. Compost at the top of your lawn, and it's going to help with that lawn too. So it's really a great product to use anywhere that you're growing plants. It's going to help. You don't even have to incorporate it. You can just lay it on top of the soil, and it's also going to help there. You use it as a surface mulch. Put it two inches. If you're doing it on your lawn, do it just like a little thin layer. But if you're using it around trees, around shrubs, around fruit trees, around blueberries, around any plant that you grow, you could even just leave it on top of that as a mulch. And it's going to do great. Mulch is going to do good things. It's going to protect your plant from temperature extremes. It's going to slow moisture loss from evaporation from the soil. And it's going to provide some slow release nutrients over time to your plant. So it's got so many great benefits. I already talked about using it in the lawn as a top dressing, and also in a potting mix. If you do grow things in pots, you can add compost to older potting mix. It'll help refresh it and give it some nutrients for the next plant that you put into that pot if you want to reuse it. Use fine texture compost. Yeah, and then you can use it in the lawn. If anybody really cares about their lawn and manages it very strictly, what I would suggest is do what they call core aeration. They've got these machines that come out, especially if you have compaction in your lawn, and it basically cuts a tiny little hole and it removes the dirt that was in that hole, and it just does that all over the place. And if you do that, and then you go and you fill those little holes with compost, that's really going to help your grass out. It breaks up compaction, it gives more space for roots to grow into, it provides nutrients, all kinds of great things that compost does in the landscape and in lawns. I'll talk just for a minute about worm composting. They call vermicomposting. This is another way to turn a lot of this organic matter into compost, except you're going to enlist the help of some red wiggler worms, these things that eat organic matter. We're going to enlist their help. You can do this with bins and bedding, and you'll have, if you have a lot of food waste, you can do it. I've seen people who don't have a lot of space in their apartment or their condo. They might do some vermicomposting. The problem is you have to have a box full of kitchen scraps and worms in your house. Not everyone loves that, to have a box of worms. But these worms will chew through a lot of your kitchen scraps and produce great compost over time. So they've got these red wiggler worm bins. They look great. You can order a big bag of red wigglers. You can get them from a worm grower. Don't get them from a bait shop. They've got these special red wigglers that you can buy just for vermicomposting. And then you could either buy or you could build some type of box or worm bin, where then you'll have just this bin of worms that are chewing through your kitchen scraps and producing nice compost at the end. It'll be a mixture. You'll have to add some bedding. Again, this will be this dry, kind of brown, carbon-rich material, stuff like shredded paper, cardboard, dead tree leaves, or already finished compost. And then you will add the kitchen scraps, fruit, vegetable, coffee grounds, tea leaves, bread, or pasta. You'll cover it with the bedding, and those worms are going to find all that stuff to be delicious. Your watermelon rind, it's going to go right through that, and it's going to be great. Kind of the same things that you don't want to put in your compost pile in your backyard as you don't want to feed to those red wigglers. Things like meat, grease, bones, or dairy products, cat or dog feces, garlic or onions or really spicy capsaicin peppers, citrus has some acid to it, or very salty or sugary foods. So don't feed your red wiggler worms gummy worms. because they're not going to like that sugary stuff. But it can be a great small-scale way to make your own compost, and worm compost and worm castings is really good for soil. And generally the vermicompost is ready after a couple months, 4 to 6. There's different ways to separate the worms out if you're interested. There's a lot more information available. This is just kind of one slide I threw in. This is how a lot of larger scale people might make compost on a home scale, is to create an aerated static pile, so where you don't have to turn it, but then you're going to introduce air through the bottom of it. And this can be a way to get a fan, one of those fan blowers that you find in the wacky inflatable arm man at the used car store. The air blowers, you blow air into this pile that you've made, and it'll make oxygen, so you don't have to turn it, and then over time it'll heat up and create compost that way. So an aerated static pile. Nowadays I see, man, they'll make you any type of product you want to try to sell it to you. They've got these machines now that you can make a countertop composting robot, and for the most part what I've seen these machines do is they basically just grind up stuff and dry it out. They don't actually make compost full of good beneficial organisms or decompose it. They're just drying out and grinding up your kitchen scraps, which can be helpful for some people, but I personally would not pay hundreds of dollars for a composting robot. Alright, so that's the end talking about compost. I hope you guys learned something. Does anybody here make compost? Anybody? A couple people? Great. I hope you guys learned something. I hope the rest of you might give it a shot. Especially if you have a lot of like hardwood leaves. Hardwood leaves are a great resource that most people just remove from their landscape. And it can be very wasteful to just take all those hardwood leaves and put all this effort raking or blowing, getting them out of your landscape when it is this great resource that cycles nutrients back through your plants. So if you've got hardwood leaves, you can just blow them or rake them right around the base for your tree and just leave them there, and they're going to break down and they're going to feed that tree. If you think about it in a natural forest, that's how it works, is those nutrients cycle through that tree. That tree grows those leaves, it drops those leaves break down, and they feed those tree roots back again. So in our landscape, if we're removing all those hardwood leaves, we're really wasting a good resource there. So if you learned anything from my talk, it's you can use hardwood leaves in your landscape as a good resource.